What's up guys, gals and pals, it's Raddy here, and in today's video we're going to be letting the dice gods decide exactly what kind of a space marine we're going to be painting and kit bashing. This, my friends, is RaddiCraft. Alright, so before we get to the rules of this challenge, I'd like to extend a huge thank you to Goobertown Hobbies. This challenge is heavily inspired by his Goobertown Roulette, and if you have been living under a rock and haven't heard of his channel by now, I definitely recommend checking it out. There's some really awesome stuff out there. Thank you, Goobertown. As for the rules of this challenge, they are really simple, so I'll explain them quickly before we get started with the actual rolling and the kit bashing. We're going to be making a total of 3 rolls as we go on with the challenge. The first one will determine the chapter of our Space Marine, the second one will give our Space Marine a trait of some kind, and the third one will determine whether we get a bonus challenge or not. The first roll will be done using a D8 and a D10. These two dice together will give us a number between 10 and 89. So there's 80 different options for the chapter, which I'll roll down quickly over there. If you want to check them in more detail, I'll also include a link to the whole table in the description down below. I've included the popular first founding chapters, but there's also a ton of underrepresented chapters with really cool lore or really cool colors that were suggested to me over on Instagram a couple of weeks back, so thanks for that. The second roll will be done using a D10, and that will determine the trait of our Space Marine. I'll put the whole list of the 10 options there, so you'll probably get an idea of what I mean with that. The third and the final roll will be done using a D20, and this will determine the bonus challenge. On numbers 1 to 10, we will get a bonus challenge that should somehow affect the paint job or the kit bashing of the miniature. I'll put the options there. As you can see, on numbers 11 to 19, nothing happens. Number 20 will allow us to re-roll one of the 3 rolls if we so wished. That's all for the rules, so I think it's time to get rolling. So I've prepared a table with all the chapters, all the traits, and all the bonuses available for us. So for the first roll, we're going to need a D8 and a D10. So these two dice together will decide a number between 10 and 89, and that number will determine the chapter that we're going to be painting today. And kit bashing, of course, let's not forget the kit bashing. So let's see what we'll get. 52. 52. And that, my friends, is the Novamarines. Interesting one. They've got a really cool color scheme. A Novamarine. And then for the second roll, we're going to be determining the trait for our Novamarine. So we use a single D10, and let's see what we get. 5. So our Novamarine is going to be a religious zealot. Interesting stuff right there. Religious Novamarine. I can't remember quite off the top of my head. Are they of the religious sort? We'll have to see. This one most certainly will be. And then for the last bonus roll, we're going to be rolling a D20. So numbers 1 to 10 will give us a bonus challenge for the painting or the kit bashing. Numbers 11 to 19 will do nothing, and number 20 will allow us to re-roll either the chapter, the trait, or the bonus roll if we wish to. So let's see what we will get, if anything. Nothing this time, folks. It's 19. So a Novamarine who happens to be a religious zealot. I think it's time to start brushing up our Novamarines' background knowledge a little bit, searching for exactly the right bits for this kit bash, and then get started with the actual work. As with any kit bash project, I started by searching for the correct bits and the materials that we might need for this. When starting a new project, it's a great idea to empty your desk of those eternity projects that you'll never finish, especially if you're filming it for YouTube. I decided to get the Ultramarines upgrade sprue for this project. I was planning on using this head with the laurels, since I think it fits a Novamarine quite well. I'm sure I'll eventually have use for the other bits as well, and there's a nice shoulder pad here that I think I'm going to use as well. Why this shoulder pad though? Well, let me explain. Our Novamarine was supposed to be a religious zealot. Well, the first idea I had was to create a chaplain of some sort. That, however, would have meant that I couldn't have done the classic Novamarine color scheme with the blocked out squares of different colors, and I was already quite fond of that. I wasn't really feeling the black armor of a chaplain at the moment. After having read about the Novamarines, I found out that they actually do pilgrimages to Macragge, and as a sign for having completed such a pilgrimage, a warrior is granted the laurels of Ultramar. Apparently these are usually painted onto the helmets of the warrior, but hey, this guy is a religious zealot. I thought that he could basically be like a regular at Macragge or something. He's got laurels for days. Laurels on his head? Check. Laurels on his shoulder pad? Check. Laurels painted onto his helmet? Sure. I mean, why not? So with this on mind, the Ultramarines upgrade sprue was really quite an obvious choice. There's a ton of laurels in there, and we'll get some good use out of it here. As for the base of the model, you might have noticed that I decided to use an easy to build Space Marine, a Primaris one. I happen to like the pose of this one, even though we'll probably adjust it a bit, and I had a box of them laying around, so why not? After having cut out all the bits from the sprue, it was time to get to work on the shoulder pad. I had to obviously scrape off this Ultramarine symbol from it, and the majority of it I got off with my hobby knife. It's quite a dull knife, so there's no real danger of me hurting myself with it, don't worry. If you do plan on following some of this stuff along at home though, please follow better knife safety or something. Do as I say, not as I do. Always cut away from yourself and, you know, all that. As you might have noticed, I'm pretty much finished with the first phase of sanding here. Now this is an invaluable trick for getting smooth surfaces when sanding. So I do the sanding with dry sandpaper first, but after that I proceed to do something called wet sanding. It's basically dipping your sandpaper in water and then using that to sand. As you can see, depending on the sandpaper you use, it can leave some residue behind, so be sure to wash your model after you're done assembling. It's a good habit to get into anyway. I don't think GW uses mold release agents or anything like this anymore, but you know, if you're scraping off your mold lines like a good boy, that will leave some residue that'll always need to be washed off. Now here's another great habit, and I think if you've ever posted miniatures online, you have heard of this. Drill your barrels. Here's another thing I like to do often when I'm working with these snap fit models. As you can see, I cut off pieces of the things that are meant to do the snap fitting. What are they called? I don't know. And I shave them off a little bit. I find that you can get a better fit for your bits like that. If you're not fond of filling gaps, using plastic glue like this is a good idea as well. It will melt the plastic together, thus helping with the gaps a little bit. Generally speaking, I only use plastic glue for bits that I don't plan to come off, such as the different parts of the body here or the backpack there. For arms and such, I prefer to use super glue, and you'll get to see in a bit exactly why I do this. As the most keen-eyed of you might have noticed, I originally had the arm with the pointing finger that the easy to build Space Marine Sergeant comes with. I decided, however, to switch it to this chainsword from the Assault Marines. It's not a Primaris chainsword, but as you can see, it fits rather nicely. I found that there is only a very little size difference between the regular Mini Marines and the Primaris Marines in terms of their arms, heads and stuff like this. Also, for religious zealots such as this guy, what's better than a chainsword to cut down heretics with? I think it's rather iconic. So here you can see me using super glue for the arms and the shoulder pads, just in case I want to adjust them later on. As I mentioned before, the heads can also sometimes be a bit wonky when going from regular vanilla Marines to Primaris Marines, so I had to add a bit of green stuff under the head there. After finding the perfect position for the head, I realized that I wasn't happy with the arm. I'm glad I used super glue there, so I just snapped it off and started looking for a better position for it. I ended up deciding on this kind of upwards held position. It creates a nice dynamic line between the leg of the Marine and the long bolter that he's holding. Like, this is really important to consider when kitbashing. It helps add some dynamism to the model, and it's always a good idea to look at the model from all angles when making important decisions like this. To further hone in on the religiousness of this model, I added a ton of these small holy trinkets to this model. For that kind of stuff, I like to use plastic glue just so it doesn't drop off. And here you can see the finished kitbash. I added a ton of purity seals, and the small book is my favorite, honestly. The Novamarines are known to be very strict followers of the Codex Astartes, so I imagine this zealot of ours is always carrying his own field version around anywhere he goes. As you can see, we got started with the painting here. I primed the model black using Vallejo airbrush colors. It's a rather nice black primer and my local art store sells it, so that's why I use it. I'll put up the specific colors on the screen for you to see, but honestly it shouldn't matter that much usually. Here I'm using a white ink to give it a heavy zenithal highlight. This is actually a lot heavier than what a zenithal highlight would usually be, because this will end up being our base coat for the white areas of the model. Alright, now to something I've never tried on an infantry model before. I'm using masking tape to mask off all the areas that will remain white. I've varnished the model before this, of course, to protect the white. This will allow us to airbrush some blue onto the areas that are supposed to be blue. For this I'm using Vallejo Prussian Blue acrylic ink. It's thinned down a lot with some airbrush medium and also some flow improver, so many thin coats are required to build up the color gradually. It will still probably look quite light at this point, but we're going to fix that in just a bit. I'm really excited to see whether this masking actually works. Well, I already know I'm recording this afterwards, thanks to movie magic, but you know, I was excited when I was doing it. So here we're darkening the color a bit more using the Citadel Contrast Space Wolves Grey. I find it to be a nice color for airbrushing shadows. This is kind of like an opposite of a zenithal airbrushing. I airbrush the model from below and I target the areas that I want to be darker, such as, for example, under the legs or the bottom of the shoulder pad here. Now here we are starting to be pretty much done with the airbrushing, and it's on to the moment of truth, ripping off the masking tape. I think this is what people usually call satisfying, and honestly it is quite satisfying to look at, so I'll just shut up for a moment and let you enjoy it. Oh yes, I think it came out quite nicely, better than I honestly expected. There's one small mistake here, some of the blue ink went to the white area, but we can fix it easily, no problem. Now for the recess shading of the armor panels, I'm going to be using black oil paint in combination with some mineral spirits. Honestly, this is like an easy mode cheat for panel lining on a lot of models, such as Space Marines. As you can see here, you can just let the capillary action do all of the work for you, literally. Just be careful if you're a brush licker like me, don't put the brush in your mouth. If you feel intimidated by using oil paints, since they're, I guess, a bit more unconventional medium for miniature painting, you can use stuff like Nuln oil or thin black paint, dark grey paint for this step if you wish to, and I do that quite often as well. But honestly, give it a shot, it's so good, so easy. Then onto some edge highlights. The white areas we're just going to edge highlight with a pure white straight away. We could try to be a bit fancy with it using an off-white first, but I wasn't feeling like doing that. We're going to get a bit fancy with the blue areas though, so don't worry. As for edge highlighting the blue panels, we're using Army Paint Trogdolite Blue, but any sort of turquoise color should work fine. This is just what I had around and this is what my local store sells, so that's why the choice. I'm honestly usually not too picky about the paints I use. There's some ones that I really don't like, some colors for some specific brands, but most of them I can work with. You just need to get to know the colors, so to speak, so you know how much to thin things down and what might be some problematic areas for different paint ranges and so on. I think we're pretty much done with the first round of blue edge highlights here. Now we're going to start gradually mixing in more white to the blue, the same turquoise still. And we're targeting these edge highlights on the areas where the light would naturally hit. Or at least where I think the light would hit, or where it looks cool. It's not an exact science. And honestly, even if it were, I'm no scientist. After doing 3 rounds of edge highlights on the blue, I do these black lines between the different colors. I also highlight the edges of the black lines. I find this gives the different sections of the armor a nice separation. It just looks better in my opinion. I'm not sure if it would make any sense to have these black lines in between. After we're done with separating the different blocks of color, we move on to the red areas. For our Novamarine here, this includes the helmet, since he's a sergeant, and the purity seals. I'm not sure how I would have done the helmet if I had to have masked it off as well, so yeah, this guy's a sergeant, sure. For the red, I use Mephisto red for the base, then I wash it with Karuberg crimson and I highlight it with mixing in Evil Sun scarlet and finally mixing in some Wild Rider red. Talking of differences between brands in different colors, I really like Mephisto red. It's such a good red. Edge highlights on the helmet, we follow the same kind of idea that we did on the rest of the armor. After the reds, we're moving on to the greens. For this model, it means the laurels and also the lenses on the helmet. We're going to base coat these using Cabalite green. It's a nice forest green, which works perfectly for our purposes. I actually messed up filming some parts of painting the helmet, including finishing up the lenses, so I've got a previous video on lenses that I'll link up in the corner if you want to check that out. We wash all the green areas using Bealtan green. After the wash has dried, we highlight them using Ogren Camo. And here you can see the finished helmet. The laurels of Ultramar I freehanded there as a sign of this guy having completed a pilgrimage to Macragge. I think a big part of this series is also learning these cool tidbits of the background of these less common chapters, while also challenging ourselves in terms of painting and kitbashing. All of the brown areas, the leather, the scrolls, the skulls, they were based using Steel Legion drab. It's a nice base for all of these. After this, we give it a heavy wash of Agrax Earthshade. After the wash has dried, we start highlighting them. We start with Steel Legion drab, then we move on to Baneblade brown. After that, we start gradually adding white to the Baneblade brown again, highlighting smaller and smaller areas each time. Despite using the same colors, I want the purity seals to end up looking a bit lighter than the leather, just to make sure it looks like a different material. I do this by going a bit more heavy with the highlights, making the brighter areas bigger than the darker areas. For the leather holster and the small bags he's got on his belt, I decided to do a bit of texturing. This was done by doing small stippling motion across the edges of the holster during the final highlight. After that, I proceed to do these scratches using light motions to swipe across the holster. Really thinned down paint works nicely for this one. I add some white to the mixture and focus these towards the edges of the holster. After that, I do these black lines under the scratches. It was also rather convenient to finish the purity seals now that I had the black on my palette. Thin paint works well, and dots tend to work better than lines oftentimes. Now with all the browns done, we're going to move on to the metal parts. For most of my metal colors, I actually really prefer Vallejo's Air range. They are thinner than your regular metallic paints, so you don't have to thin them down so much and you can cover areas more easily. I used the contrast paint Flesh Tearer Red to paint these red areas on the bolter casing and the chainsword. After I've painted them, I wash them using Carroburg Crimson straight out of the pot. I want to end up with this kind of a dull metallic red finish. All the silver areas we're going to wash using Nuln Oil. Honestly, painting guns and most weapons is probably my least favorite part of painting 40k models. So this technique I'm showing with the contrast is also speeding up the process for me. The gold areas are painted using Retributor armor. After that, I wash them with my own mix. It's got Druchii Violet, Nuln Oil, Agrax Earthshade and Rakeland Fleshshade. Now we move on to stipple some silver onto the weapons, also the red parts, and we also stipple some black on the same areas. This is a nice way to give a really weathered look, and it's also really quick and efficient. We also dab on some of the armor wash that I mentioned, just to random places to create some color variation. Then we highlight the rest of the silver areas using Army Painter Shining Silver. Even on the areas that got the sponge treatment with the silver earlier, it's a good idea to go back and just make sure if there's some areas that could use a highlight. The gold we highlight mixing the same Shining Silver with the base coat, which was Retributor armor. And here you can see the whole model with all the metallics done. For once, I also remembered to go and paint all those small rivets and random bits that I generally tend to forget. Then we can move on to the face. I'm going to base coat it using thin coats of Cadian Flesh Tone. After that, I overbrushed most of the face with Cadian Flesh Tone mixed with some white. Then we're going to start making a glaze. We're going to use Doombull Brown and a lot of medium. This is the sort of consistency I go for. We wash this glaze onto the recesses on the face. Apologies on the horribly out of focus footage, by the way. I'll do my best to explain what's going on here. So we're going to make a similar glaze using Rhinox hide, and we're focusing this on the deepest recesses. The technique I use to paint the face here is straight out of Darren Latham's face tutorial, so a huge shout out to him. It really helped me level up my face painting game. What we're doing here is we're gradually adding more white to the Cadian flesh tone and highlighting smaller and smaller areas on the face, focusing on things like the cheekbones, the nose, the forehead, and so on. Since our Novamarine zealot here is a bit of an older fellow, I'm also trying to create some wrinkles on his forehead. And here you can see the whole face before we move on to adding some color. First we're mixing in some dark Reaper into the skin tone and painting that under the eyes. Then we're making a thin red glaze using Mephiston Red and the skin tone. I glazed this under the cheeks and onto the lip. After the glaze has dried, I will highlight the lip using a bit more of a pink tone. Adding reds and greys to how you paint faces really helps the model come alive. And here we have some out of focus footage of me painting the eyes. The whites are painted using white and the irises are painted using black. A nice technique to painting eyes is to actually try to imagine where the model might be looking. Maybe ask a friend of yours to look into that kind of a direction so you can see how the pupils should be placed. Apart from that, it's just a matter of practice really. If you need more practice painting eyes, I suggest painting Space Wolves, or I guess other models that don't use helmets. Now here's a really cool tidbit about the Novamarines. Despite being really Codex compliant, they have these tribal tattoos that tell of the battles they've been in and so on. For these tattoos I just decided to scribble on something that looked cool in my opinion and didn't look too distinctly like Norse or anything like that would create associations with Space Wolves. My Space Wolves often tend to have tattoos on their faces. Here you can see me base coating the eyebrows and the beard using Celestra Grey. The model doesn't have sculpted on eyebrows, as is the case with most Space Marines, but I really like to paint them onto my models. The Celestra Grey is then washed using Contrast Apothecary White. And after that has dried, I use some pure white to draw these sort of lines to suggest the strands of his beard and the eyebrows and the mustache, of course. And here you can see the finished face in all its glory. It's even mostly in focus, oh boy. Alright, and now we're done with the face, we're moving on to basing for a bit, even though there's some stuff to paint still. I use the Agrellan Badlands texture paint here and some Kittilite for the stones to add some variety. After it has dried up, I give the base a wash of Agrax Earthshade. I also did a little bit of dry brushing using Baneblade Brown and mixing in some white, but I didn't catch it on camera. But you know how to dry brush, right? The rocks I base using Dawnstone, then I wash them with Nuln Oil, and lastly I kind of overbrush them using Dawnstone mixed with Celestra Grey. Then we're going to move on to the markings on the pauldrons. Halfway during this project I realized that the Deathwatch Veteran sprue actually has a shoulder pad with the Novamarines chapter symbol on it. Well, it was too late at that point. Besides, I thought it would be a nice challenge to try and freehand something like this on camera as a practice for future projects. I'll eventually have to freehand a lot of different kinds of chapter icons, and this is not one of the harder ones really. I use Celestra Grey to begin with, and then I start adding more white eventually to create some light shading onto the icon as well to match the rest of the shoulder pad. While this sweet sped up material of me freehanding the chapter icon is going on, I'd like to remind that if you have enjoyed this video, please do like it and subscribe to the channel. I have plans for more of these videos, but they do require quite a lot of work to complete, so any kind of support really helps me keep going with this. I also thought that some of you viewers might be interested in participating in the KITBASH Roulette, so I decided to start up a Discord channel. I've put the link down in the description below. Anybody's welcome to join. There's a separate channel there for Space Marine KITBASH Roulette. Feel free to post pictures there, your dice results, discussion, ask for tips regarding kit bashing, anything that you want to do related to this. I also thought it might be a nice idea to use that channel to pick up some community submissions and show them in the future KITBASH Roulette videos, in the end or something. So yeah, if you feel like challenging yourself and maybe learning something new, feel free to participate and post the results. I'd be happy to show them in the next video. Now we're on to the finishing touches. I tied the base in with the model using some weathering pigments, and the base rim is painted black. I varnished the model here before adding some blood for the blood god. I think the blood does a great job in adding some more visual interest onto the model. However, I think it's important to remember that less is more. You can really easily overdo it. I also added this small tuft of grass onto the base and tied the model in with the base a bit more by adding some blood for the blood god on the base as well. Oh, hi. Yes, I'm still here. Hello. Yes, Novamarines. Yes, cool. All done in one session, thanks to modern day movie magic. Am I right? Anyway, I think with the model complete, the only thing left is our grand reveal of the Novamarine. Which chapter would you like to see next? Be sure to leave a comment down in the comments below, and also upvote your favorite suggestions. I think every couple of episodes I might just cheat a bit and choose the chapter based on the suggestions instead of doing the first roll. Did you hear something? I don't know. Either way, I won't keep you waiting any longer. I think it's time for the grand reveal. Thank you for watching. Raddi out.
Something had gone into him, for the squad sergeant, Brother Quintus Lexon, generally famed for his knowledge of the Codex Astartes, had charged at a mob of mutants in what seemed like a tactically ill-considered move. His squad could only barely make out the form of their sergeant amidst the settling dust. Clearly, the charge had been well calculated. He opened his mouth and it seemed as if the surrounding roar of battle paused just for him to speak his mind.
Flee now, you fallen heretics, for I stand victorious over your commander. Flee now and cry for absolution, for we are the sons of Gilliman, and whilst we fight, we will prevail. For honor!